She painted portraits of everyone who died until people realized she was finishing them before the deaths actually happened. The dust kicked up around her worn boots as she walked into Dustwater Ridge on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with heat and silence. Nobody knew her name then. Nobody knew what she carried in that small canvas bag slung over her shoulder, or why her eyes held the kind of sadness that made grown men look away. She was young, maybe 20, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid and a dress that had seen better days. Her hands were stained with colors, blues and reds and yellows that seemed too bright for a place like Dustwater Ridge, where everything wore the same shade of brown dust and faded dreams. The town square sat in the middle of Main Street like a wound that wouldn't heal. A few wooden benches circled a dry fountain that hadn't seen water in 3 years. Old Martha Hayes sat on her usual bench, feeding breadcrumbs to the sparrows that gathered at her feet each morning. She looked up when a young woman stopped in front of her. "Morning," Martha said, squinting against the sun. The girl nodded but didn't speak. She set down her bag and pulled out a small wooden easel, unfolding its legs with careful hands. Then came the canvas, white and clean as fresh snow. Then came the brushes, each one worn smooth from use. And finally the paints. Martha watched with growing curiosity as the girl arranged her supplies. The other folks on the street had stopped their morning business to stare too. In a town like Dustwater Ridge, anything new was worth watching, especially when it came in the form of a pretty young woman with paint-stained fingers and eyes like deep water. The girl began to paint. Her brush moved across the canvas with sure strokes, mixing colors that seemed to catch the morning light and hold it. She painted the way some people pray, with complete attention, as if the world around her had disappeared. And slowly, a face began to appear on the canvas. Martha's face. The old woman's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen herself painted before, had never owned a mirror nice enough to show her own reflection clearly. But there she was, emerging from the white canvas like she was walking out a dream. The girl had captured something Martha didn't even know she possessed, a kindness in her eyes, a gentleness in the way her mouth curved when she smiled. "Why are you painting me?" Martha asked softly. The girl's brush paused for just a moment. Then she continued painting, adding shadows to the hollows of Martha's cheeks, light to the silver in her hair. "I paint who I see," the girl finally said. Her voice was quiet, like water running over stones. "I paint who needs to be remembered." Martha felt something stir in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She had been forgotten by most folks in Dustwater Ridge. Her children had moved away. Her husband had been in the ground for 5 years now. She spent her days feeding sparrows and watching the world go by, invisible as dust. But this girl saw her, really saw her. The painting took 3 hours. 3 hours of careful brushstrokes and mixed colors, of the girl stepping back to study her work, then moving forward to add another detail. The sun climbed higher, and more people gathered to watch. Doc Henderson paused on his way to check on the widow Thompson's fever. Sheriff Bradley tipped his hat and lingered longer than he should have. Even the children stopped their games to stare. When the painting was finished, Martha couldn't speak. The face on the canvas looked back at her with eyes full of life, full of stories worth telling. It was her, but it was also more than her. It was the woman she had been when she was young and full of dreams. It was the woman she still was, deep down, beneath the years of dust and loneliness. "It's beautiful," Martha whispered, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. The girl nodded and began cleaning her brushes. "It's you," she said simply. That evening, Martha Hayes went to bed with a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt since her wedding day. She had been seen. She had been remembered. She mattered enough for someone to spend 3 hours capturing her face on canvas. She died peacefully in her sleep, a smile still on her lips. When Sheriff Bradley found her the next morning, he stood in her small kitchen for a long time, hat in his hands. Martha looked peaceful, younger somehow, like the years had lifted off her shoulders and left her free. It wasn't until he was walking back to his office that he remembered the painting. The girl with the paint-stained hands who had spent 3 hours capturing Martha's face on canvas, who had finished the portrait just hours before Martha passed. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Sad timing. Martha had been old, and old people died. That was the way of things. But then the girl set up her easel again the next day, this time in front of the general store, where she painted Jim Morrison, the store owner who had been coughing for weeks. The portrait showed Jim with clear eyes and steady hands, the way he had looked before the sickness started eating away at his lungs. Jim died 2 days later, coughing up blood in Doc Henderson's office. The whispers started then. Quiet at first, the way whispers always began in small towns. Strange thing, that girl painting folks just before they pass. Makes you wonder if she knows something the rest of us don't. Maybe it's just bad luck. But when she painted old Sam Tucker and he was found dead in his barn 3 days later, the whispers grew louder. And when she painted Mrs. Eleanor Finch and Eleanor passed in her garden that same afternoon, the whispers turned to fear. People began crossing the street when they saw the girl setting up her easel. They pulled their children close and hurried past, eyes down, afraid to catch her attention. Afraid she might see something in their faces that they didn't want to know about. The girl seemed to understand. She had seen fear before, in other towns, in other faces. She had learned to recognize the way people looked at her when they realized what her paintings meant. Like she was death itself, walking among them with brushes and paint. But she kept painting, because she had to, because the faces called to her, and she couldn't stop seeing them. Couldn't stop knowing what they needed her to know. She painted because someone had to remember. Someone had to see the beauty in a person's last days, the grace in their final moments. Someone had to love them enough to capture their souls before they flew away, even if that someone was feared, even if that someone was alone. The girl packed her supplies each evening as the sun set over Dustwater Ridge, her hands steady despite the weight of what she carried. Tomorrow there would be another face, another story, another goodbye that only she could paint. And somewhere in the growing darkness, she wondered if anyone would ever understand that her gift wasn't about bringing death. It was about honoring the life that remained. Sheriff Tom Bradley found her by the dried-up creek bed on the third morning after Eleanor Finch's funeral. The girl sat on a fallen log with her easel before her, painting the empty water where minnows used to swim. Her brush moved slowly across the canvas, catching the light that bounced off smooth stones and dead cattails. "Most folks are calling you a witch," Tom said, settling his weight on a nearby rock. His boots crunched on the gravel, but she didn't look up from her painting. "Most folks call things they don't understand by the wrong name," she replied. Her voice carried no anger, just the tired sound of someone who had heard it all before. Tom studied her profile. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe 19. There was something broken in the way she held her shoulders, like she was carrying weight that didn't belong to her. "What should I call you then?" "Clara." She dipped her brush in blue paint, then mixed it with white until it became the color of morning sky. "Clara Whitmore." "And what are you, Clara Whitmore?" This time she did look at him. Her eyes were the same blue-white as the paint on her brush, and they held depths that made Tom's chest tighten. "I'm someone who sees things coming before they happen. Someone who paints what needs to be remembered." Tom had been sheriff in Dustwater Ridge for 8 years. He had seen his share of strange things, men who could track a deer through solid rock, women who could predict the weather by the way their bones ached. But this was different. This felt like something that shouldn't exist in the natural world. Why do they die after you paint them? Clara's brush stopped moving. For a long moment, she stared at the creek bed where water should have been flowing. "They don't die because I paint them. I paint them because they're already dying. The knowing just comes to me like thirst comes when you need water." "How long have you had this knowing?" The question seemed to age her right before his eyes. Lines appeared around her mouth, and her shoulders curved inward like she was protecting something fragile inside her chest. "Since I was 14. Since I watched my mama and papa and little sister die of the fever. And I couldn't do anything but sit there and paint their faces so I wouldn't forget them when they were gone." Tom felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't witchcraft. This was grief with nowhere to go, love with no place to land. I'm sorry. Clara nodded and went back to her painting. People think I bring death with me. But death was already there when I arrived. I just help it be beautiful instead of forgotten. That afternoon, Tom walked through town and saw how people moved when Clara was near. They crossed streets, pulled children behind skirts, whispered prayers under their breath. Fear had settled over Dustwater Ridge like dust after a windstorm, coating everything, getting into the cracks where light used to live. But there was one person who didn't cross the street. Billy Morrison was 10 years old and had been alone since his parents died in a wagon accident 2 winters back. He lived behind the church, sleeping in the small room where they stored hymnals and candles. Folks looked after him the way small towns do, a meal here, a coin there, but mostly they let him raise himself. Tom watched from his office window as Billy approached Clara's easel that evening. She had set up near the old oak tree where the town held its meetings. The boy walked right up to her like she was any other person, not the harbinger of death people whispered she was. "What are you painting now?" Billy asked. Clara looked down at him with surprise. It had been days since anyone had spoken to her without fear in their voice. "The tree," she said, "the way the light falls through its branches." Billy studied the canvas. "It looks lonely." "Trees can't be lonely," Clara said, but her voice was soft. "Sure they can. This one's been standing here for 50 years, watching people come and go, watching them die, never getting to go anywhere itself." Billy tilted his head. "Maybe that's why you paint it. Because you understand." Clara's brush trembled in her hand. This boy, this child who should have been afraid of her, had seen straight through to the heart of what she carried. The loneliness, the weight of watching, the burden of being the one who remembered. "What's your name?" she asked. "Billy Morrison. My folks used to run the general store before they died. Now Mr. Henderson runs it, but not as good as my papa did." He sat down in the dirt beside her easel. "What's yours?" "Clara. Are you going to paint me, Clara?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She set down her brush and looked at this boy who had no fear in his eyes, only curiosity and something that might have been friendship. "I don't paint everyone I meet, Billy. Only the ones who are going to die soon." Clara nodded. "Good," Billy said, settling back against the tree trunk. "Because I got a lot of living left to do. I'm going to see the ocean someday. And maybe build a house with a real floor, not just dirt." That night, Clara dreamed of Billy with gray hair and grandchildren, old and happy and surrounded by love. She woke with tears on her cheeks and hope in her chest for the first time in years. But the next morning brought angry voices and clenched fists. A group of men had gathered outside the boarding house where Clara rented a room. Tom pushed through the crowd and found Marcus Webb, the blacksmith, holding a rope. "She's got to go, Sheriff," Marcus said. "She's poisoned. Death follows her around like a hungry dog." "She hasn't hurt anyone," Tom replied. "Tell that to Martha Hayes' family. Tell that to Jim Morrison's widow." Marcus stepped closer, and Tom could smell whiskey on his breath. "My Sarah's been coughing. What happens if that witch decides to paint my Sarah?" The crowd murmured agreement. Tom looked at their faces and saw genuine fear mixed with the kind of anger that came from helplessness. They couldn't fight death, so they would fight the girl who reminded them it existed. "I'll talk to her," Tom said, "but nobody touches her. Not while I'm sheriff." He found Clara packing her few belongings into the same canvas bag she had arrived with. Billy sat on her bed, watching with the serious expression children wore when they didn't understand why the adult world was so complicated. "You don't have to leave," Tom said. Clara folded her spare dress and placed it carefully in the bag. "Yes, I do. I've seen this before. Fear turns to anger, and anger turns to fire. I won't let them hurt Billy because he was kind to me. Where will you go?" "Wherever the next town is. Wherever people need to be remembered." She closed the bag and looked at Tom with those deep water eyes. "Thank you for trying to understand." Billy walked her to the edge of town, carrying her easel like it weighed nothing. At the place where the road curved away from Dustwater Ridge, Clara knelt down, so she was eye level with the boy. "You be careful," she said, "and remember what I told you about the ocean." "I will." "And, Clara," Billy's voice was small but steady, "I think you're brave." Clara felt her heart break and mend at the same time. Someone had seen past the fear to what she really was, not death's messenger, but love's keeper. Someone understood that her paintings weren't endings, but the only way she knew how to say goodbye. As she walked away from Dustwater Ridge, Clara wondered if there would ever be a place where people could see her gift for what it truly was, not a curse, but the deepest kind of compassion a human heart could hold. Clara had been walking for 3 days when a knowing hit her like a fist to the chest. She stopped in the middle of the dusty road between Dustwater Ridge and nowhere, her canvas bag sliding off her shoulder to land in the dirt with a soft thud. Billy. The boy's face appeared in her mind, as clear as if he were standing before her. Not the Billy she had left behind, healthy and bright-eyed and full of dreams about the ocean. This Billy was pale, his breathing shallow, fever burning in his cheeks like twin flames. She had been wrong. So terribly, desperately wrong. Clara turned around and began walking back toward Dustwater Ridge, each step heavy with dread and purpose. The sun climbed higher as she walked, beating down on her shoulders, but she felt cold all the way through to her bones. She reached the town as evening shadows grew long across the main street. People saw her coming and scattered like leaves before a storm wind. Doors slammed shut, windows closed with sharp snaps. By the time she reached the church where Billy lived, the street was empty except for dust devils spinning in the growing dark. She found him in his small room behind the altar, curled on his narrow bed with a quilt pulled up to his chin. His face was flushed with fever, and his breath came in short, painful gasps. Doc Henderson sat beside him, worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "Pneumonia," the doc said without looking up. "Started yesterday." Moving fast, Clara set down her bag and pulled out her easel with steady hands. The doc watched her with something that might have been relief or might have been resignation. He had seen enough death to know when it was coming, and he had seen enough of Clara's paintings to know what they meant. "Will it hurt him?" Doc Henderson asked. "No more than he's already hurting," Clara replied, arranging her brushes with the careful attention of a woman preparing for prayer. "Maybe less." Billy's eyes fluttered open as she mixed her paints. When he saw her, he tried to smile, but the effort left him breathless. "Clara," he whispered, "you came back." "I had to," she said, dipping her brush in blue paint the color of summer skies. "I made you a promise about the ocean, remember?" As she painted, Clara began to speak. The words came slowly at first, like water from a long dry well, then faster as the dam inside her heart finally broke. "I was 14 when it started," she said, painting the curve of Billy's cheek, the way the lamplight caught in his hair. "My family lived outside Tombstone in a little house my papa built with his own hands. Mama grew vegetables behind the house. My sister Lucy was only 8, and she collected smooth stones from the creek." Her brush moved across the canvas, capturing not just Billy's features but something deeper. The brightness in his eyes, the dreams he carried, the way he saw goodness where others saw only fear. The fever came in summer. First Papa got sick, then Mama, then Lucy. I tried to help them, tried to cool their foreheads with wet cloths, tried to get them to drink water. But I was just a girl, and the sickness was stronger than I was. Billy's breathing had grown quieter, more peaceful, as if her voice was medicine for his pain. The night before Papa died, I dreamed about him. I saw his face so clear, surrounded by golden light, and I knew he was saying goodbye. When I woke up, I had to paint what I'd seen. Had to capture that light before it faded. I painted him and Mama and Lucy, and they all looked so beautiful, so free from pain. And then, one by one, they left me. Clara paused to mix more colors, her hands trembling only slightly. That's when I understood. The dreams, the knowing, it wasn't a curse. It was love, the deepest kind of love, the kind that can't bear to let someone go without honoring who they were. "Does it hurt?" Billy asked, his voice barely a whisper. The dying. Clara looked at him over her canvas, this boy who had been the only person to see past her gift to her heart. "No, sweetheart. It's like going to sleep after a long, hard day, and someone who loves you very much is there to hold your hand." Billy nodded and closed his eyes. "Will you stay with me?" "Every moment," Clara promised. Outside, she could hear voices gathering, angry voices growing louder. The sound of boots on wood, of doors slamming, of fear turning into action. Someone had seen her return. Someone had spread the word that the Deathbringer was back, painting her poison in the house of God. The portrait was nearly finished when Sheriff Bradley pushed through the church doors. Behind him came Marcus Webb and a dozen other men, some carrying torches, others with ropes coiled in their hands. "Step away from the boy," Marcus commanded, his voice rough with whiskey and rage. Clara didn't move from her easel. "He's dying, Marcus. With or without my painting, he's dying. Because of you," Marcus snarled. "Because you brought your curse back to our town." "Look at him," Clara said quietly. "Really look at him." Against their will, the men's eyes went to Billy's face. The fever had broken while Clara painted, and his breathing had grown steady and deep. He looked peaceful, younger somehow, as if Clara's brush had painted away not just his pain, but years of loneliness and loss. "I don't bring death," Clara said, adding the final touches to Billy's portrait. "Death comes whether I'm here or not. But I give it meaning. I make it beautiful. I make sure that when someone leaves this world, they're remembered not for their dying, but for their living." Doc Henderson stepped forward, his medical bag in his hands. He looked at Billy, then at Clara, then at the angry faces surrounding them. The boy's fever broke. His breathing is clear. "I don't understand it, but he's going to be fine." A murmur went through the crowd. Clara looked down at her canvas and gasped. The portrait showed Billy not as she had seen him in her vision, pale and dying, but as he truly was. Alive, bright-eyed, full of dreams about oceans and real floors and all the tomorrows he would live to see. "I was wrong," Clara whispered, wonder in her voice. "For the first time since I was 14, I was wrong." Marcus Webb lowered his rope, confusion replacing anger on his face. "What does that mean?" Clara set down her brush and looked at the men who had come to drive her away, or worse. "It means maybe my gift isn't just about death. Maybe it's about love. Maybe it's about showing people what they mean to someone else, what they're worth, what they should fight to keep." Billy stirred on his bed and opened his eyes. When he saw Clara's finished portrait, he smiled, a real smile, bright as sunshine on water. "Is that really how you see me?" he asked. "That's how the world should see you," Clara replied. "That's how God sees you." The crowd began to disperse, men slipping away into the night with their torches and their shame. Only Sheriff Bradley remained, his hat in his hands, studying the portrait with thoughtful eyes. "What happens now?" he asked. Clara looked at Billy, who was sitting up in bed now. The color returned to his cheeks. She thought about all the faces she had painted over the years, all the goodbyes she had helped make beautiful. And for the first time, she wondered if her gift might be bigger than she had ever imagined. Perhaps there was more to her calling than capturing last moments. Perhaps there was also the power to help people see the precious life they still had time to live. 3 weeks after Billy's fever broke, Clara was still in Dustwater Ridge. She had rented a small room above the bakery and set up her easel in different places each day. Sometimes by the schoolhouse, sometimes near the well, sometimes under the old oak tree where she had first met Billy. But she wasn't painting portraits anymore. Instead, she painted the town itself. The way morning light fell across the church steps. The pattern's dust made when wine swept down Main Street. The faces of children playing in the dirt, their laughter bright as silver coins tossed in the air. People had stopped crossing the street when they saw her. They still watched her with careful eyes, but the fear had changed into something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the kind of respect people gave to things they didn't understand but had learned weren't dangerous. Billy visited her every day after his chores were done. He would sit beside her easel and tell her about his dreams, the ocean he wanted to see, the house he wanted to build, the family he hoped to have someday. Clara listened and painted, and sometimes she would catch herself smiling without knowing why. "You're different now," Billy said one afternoon as Clara painted the cemetery on the hill outside town. "Lighter somehow." Clara paused, her brush loaded with yellow paint for the wildflowers that grew between the headstones. "How do you mean?" "Before, you carried everyone's dying with you. Now you're carrying their living instead. The boy's words hit her like truth always did, sudden and bright and impossible to ignore. She had been carrying death for so long that she had forgotten what life felt like. But here in Dustwater Ridge, with Billy's friendship and the town's slow acceptance, she was learning again. That evening, as Clara cleaned her brushes by lamplight, Sheriff Bradley knocked on her door. When she opened it, she saw something in his face that made her stomach turn cold. "It's Doc Henderson," Tom said quietly. "He's asking for you." Clara found the old doctor in his office, lying on the narrow cot where he examined patients. His skin was gray, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that reminded Clara too much of her sister Lucy's final hours. "Heart's giving out," Doc said when he saw her. "Been feeling it for days. Thought you should know." Clara sat in the chair beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Do you want me to paint you?" Doc Henderson smiled, and for a moment he looked like the young man he must have been 40 years ago. "I've been thinking about that, about what your paintings really mean." "What do you think they mean?" "I think they're love letters," he said. "Love letters to people who need to know they mattered, who need to know someone saw the best in them before they go." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. In all her years of painting, no one had ever understood so clearly what she was trying to do. "Will you write me a love letter, Clara Whitmore?" Clara nodded and went to get her supplies. When she returned, half the town seemed to have gathered outside Doc's office. Word traveled fast in small places, and everyone knew Doc Henderson was dying. He had brought most of them into the world, had held their hands through fevers and broken bones and all the small pains that make up a life. Clara set up her easel where Doc could see her work. As she began to paint, people pressed closer to the windows, their faces pale with grief and wonder. But this portrait was different from all the others. Instead of painting Doc as he lay dying, Clara painted him as she had seen him that first day when she arrived in town, walking down Main Street with his medical bag, purpose in his step, kindness in his eyes. She painted the doctor who had delivered babies and set broken bones and sat with the dying until they weren't alone anymore. As she worked, Doc began to talk. His voice was weak, but it carried to every corner of the room and out through the open windows to the crowd gathered outside. "I've been a doctor for 37 years, he said. "Seen more death than most men should. Always wondered what it would be like when my turn came. If I'd be afraid. If it would hurt." Clara mixed blues and greens for his eyes, capturing the intelligence there, the compassion that had never dimmed even after decades of watching people suffer. "But watching you paint, Clara, I understand something I never did before. Death isn't the opposite of life. It's just the end of one story and the beginning of another. And if someone takes the time to tell your story right, to see the good you tried to do, then maybe that's all any of us can ask for." The crowd outside had grown silent. Even the children had stopped their playing to listen. Through the windows, Clara could see faces wet with tears, people holding each other, remembering all the ways Doc Henderson had touched their lives. "Tell them," Doc whispered, his voice growing fainter. "Tell them I tried to help. Tell them I wasn't perfect, but I tried." Clara's brush moved across the canvas with sure strokes, painting not just Doc's face, but his essence. The healer, the friend, the man who had spent his life easing other people's pain. "They know," Clara said softly. "Look at them. They know." Doc turned his head toward the windows where the townspeople stood watching. Martha Webb was there, the woman whose son Doc had saved from scarlet fever. Old Pete Sullivan, whose leg Doc had set when it was crushed under a horse. Sarah Chun from a laundry, whose baby Doc had delivered during the worst blizzard in 20 years. "Clara," Doc said, his voice barely a whisper now. "Thank you for helping me see how I'll be remembered." He closed his eyes and was gone, a smile still on his lips. The silence that followed was different from the fearful, quiet Clara had known in other towns. This was the silence of respect, of love, of a community saying goodbye to someone who had given his life to serving them. Clara finished the portrait by lamplight, adding the final details that would capture not just how Doc Henderson looked, but who he was. When she was done, she turned the canvas so the crowd outside could see. A sound went up from the gathered people. Not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh. It was the sound of recognition, of seeing someone they loved exactly as they remembered him. Doc Henderson looked back at them from the canvas, alive and whole and ready to heal whatever hurt they brought to him. Sheriff Bradley was the first to speak. "It's perfect. It's exactly how he should be remembered." One by one, people began to share their memories. Stories of how Doc had helped them, how he had been there in their darkest hours, how he had made their lives better just by caring. As they talked, Clara understood something that had taken her 6 years to learn. Her gift wasn't about predicting death. It wasn't about bringing endings or carrying curses. It was about love, the kind of love that sees the best in people and refuses to let them be forgotten. It was about helping communities say goodbye, helping families remember not the dying but the living, not the leaving but all the love that would remain. The next morning, Clara set up her easel in the town square one last time. But instead of painting a person, she painted the whole town, every building, every tree, every face in the crowd that had gathered to watch her work. She painted Dustwater Ridge as it really was, a place where people cared for each other, where strangers could become family, where love could overcome fear if given enough time and patience. When the painting was finished, she signed it at the bottom, "For Dustwater Ridge, where I learned that every life is a love letter waiting to be written." Clara Whitmore. Billy helped her pack her supplies, his young face serious with the weight of goodbye. "Will you come back?" he asked. Clara looked around at the town that had taught her the true meaning of her gift. "Someday," she said, "when you're old and gray and full of stories about the ocean. Will you paint me then?" Clara smiled and ruffled his hair. "I'll paint you exactly as you are. Someone who saw love where others saw only fear. Someone who helped a lost girl find her way home." As Clara walked out of Dustwater Ridge for the second and final time, she carried with her not the weight of death, but the lightness of understanding. Her brush had always been a bridge between worlds, not between life and death, but between fear and love, between forgetting and remembering, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truth that lives in every human heart. And in that truth, she had finally found her peace.